James stared at the scar, his breath catching in his throat. He had seen plenty of injuries on horses before, but this one was different. It wasn't the kind of wound that came from a fight with another animal or an accident in the wild. This was deliberate, precise. Someone had cut this Mustang, and from the look of it, they had done so a long time ago. Emily ran her fingers gently over the mark, her expression darkening. "This isn't just an old injury," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This was done by a person." James felt a slow burn of anger rise in his chest. Wild Mustangs weren't just any horses. They were strong, untamed, and fiercely independent. No one had any business harming one. He knew that there were people who saw Mustangs as a nuisance, especially ranchers who thought they competed for grazing land. But to injure a horse like this, leave it for dead in the middle of winter, there had to be more to the story. The Mustang let out a faint shuddering breath, snapping James back to the present. It was still alive, but barely. There was no time to stand around wondering how it got here. "We need to move it," James said firmly. "If we leave it out here any longer, it won't make it." Emily nodded and reached into her truck for supplies. They worked quickly, wrapping the Mustang in thick blankets and using a portable heater Emily had brought to help stabilize its body temperature. James brought out an old sled he had used for hauling firewood, and with effort, they managed to shift the Mustang onto it. Every second counted, and James felt the weight of urgency pressing on him. They got the horse inside James's barn, where it was at least sheltered from the wind. He had an empty stall filled with hay, and they carefully settled the Mustang in. Emily set up an IV with warm fluids, while James rubbed the horse's legs, trying to bring warmth back into its frozen limbs. Hours passed. The sun had fully risen by now, but the barn remained dimly lit, the air heavy with worry. James watched the Mustang's slow, uneven breathing, his mind racing with questions. Who did this? Why was the Mustang out here alone? And, more importantly, was someone looking for it? Emily finished checking the IV and sat back on her heels. If it survives the next few hours, it might have a chance. James exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. He had taken in sick or injured animals before, but this was different. This wasn't just a horse in trouble. This was something bigger, as if to confirm his suspicions, a noise outside made him freeze. It was faint, almost nothing, but years of living in the countryside had sharpened his instincts. Someone was out there. James and Emily exchanged a look. Without a word, James grabbed his coat and stepped outside. The cold hit him like a slap, but he ignored it, scanning the tree line. Silence. Then, movement, a shadow, just at the edge of his property. James's heartbeat picked up. Someone was out there, watching. "Hey!" he called out, his voice firm, but not aggressive. No response. The figure hesitated for a moment, then turned and disappeared into the trees. James took a step forward, his gut telling him to follow, but Emily's voice stopped him. "James," she said from behind him. "Don't!" He clenched his jaw but nodded. She was right. Charging into the woods after a stranger wouldn't get him any answers. But one thing was clear. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone knew about the Mustang, and they didn't want it to be found. James turned back to the barn, his mind racing. If someone was watching, that meant they might come back. And if this Mustang had been running from something or someone, then it was still in danger. And now, so were they. James couldn't shake the unease settling deep in his gut. The Mustang's presence on his land was no accident. Someone had left it here. Or worse, chased it until it collapsed. The old wound on its neck told him that this horse had a history. one that likely wasn't pleasant. The question was, who had heard it, and why had it ended up here? Inside the barn, the Mustang lay still, its breath slow and shallow. Emily worked tirelessly, adjusting the IV, rubbing warmth back into the animal's frozen legs, checking for any additional injuries beneath its thick coat. James watched her, knowing she was the only reason this horse had any chance at survival. "You've seen injuries like this before?" James finally asked, breaking the heavy silence. Emily hesitated. "Not often," she admitted, "but I've heard stories. There are people who take wild Mustangs and try to break them, force them into submission for profit. The scars don't always come from the process itself. Some come from punishment." She glanced up at James, her expression hard. If this Mustang was in someone's hands before, it may have escaped. The morning air was crisp, carrying a biting chill that made even the trees groan under the weight of last night's frost. James Carter, a retired rancher who had spent most of his life working with horses, stepped onto his porch, wrapping his thick coat tighter around him. He took a deep breath, his warm breath fogging in the icy air. It was just another ordinary winter morning, until he noticed something strange near the edge of his property. At first, he thought it was just another fallen branch, or maybe a pile of snow that had been blown in by the wind. But as he squinted, his heart skipped a beat. There, partially buried beneath a thick layer of frost and snow, was the unmistakable shape of an animal. James's gut twisted. He had seen enough in his lifetime to know when something wasn't right. Without hesitation, he pulled on his boots and rushed down the steps, his breath coming in quick, visible puffs as he trudged through the deep snow. As he got closer, his fears were confirmed. It was a horse, a wild Mustang, its powerful body stiff and unmoving, its dark coat nearly unrecognizable, under the ice clinging to it. James dropped to his knees beside the animal, pressing his gloved hands against its neck, searching for any sign of life. For a terrifying moment, there was nothing. But then, so faint he almost missed it, he felt it. A slow, weak pulse. James's mind raced. The Mustang was barely alive, frozen to the bone, and completely unresponsive. He had no idea how long it had been out here, or how it had even ended up in his yard. Wild Mustangs weren't common this close to town, especially in the dead of winter. What had driven this powerful creature so far from its herd, only to collapse on his property? He didn't have time to think. The only thing that mattered was saving this horse before it was too late. With a strength he hadn't used in years, James dug his arms under the Mustang's massive body, struggling against its weight and the frost that had practically glued it to the ground. It was going to take more than just his own strength. He needed help. James stumbled back to his house, throwing the door open and grabbing his phone with frozen fingers. He called the only person he knew would understand the urgency of the situation, Dr. Emily Lawson, the town's best large animal veterinarian. "James?" Emily's voice was groggy, barely awake. It was still early after all. "Emily, I need you here. Now. I've got a Mustang in my yard, frozen, barely breathing." There was a pause. Then the sound of rustling as Emily likely jumped out of bed. "A Mustang! James, how?" "I don't know," he cut in. "But if we don't do something fast, it won't make it." "I'm on my way," she said without hesitation. James hung up and rushed back outside. Grabbing an old blanket from his truck, he spread it over the horse, trying to shield it from the cold, though he knew it wasn't enough. He could feel the Mustang's shallow breaths against his palm, growing weaker by the second. Minutes felt like hours as he knelt there, watching ice crystals form along the Mustang's whiskers. Its long lashes dusted with frost, James whispered to the horse, soft words of reassurance, though he wasn't sure if it could even hear him. Then, in the distance, the sound of an engine. Emily's truck skidded to a stop, and she jumped out, barely shutting the door behind her. She was already pulling on her gloves as she ran toward James. "Tell me everything," she said, kneeling beside him. James quickly explained how he had found the horse, how it wasn't moving at first, and how it barely had a pulse. Emily nodded, placing her stethoscope against the Mustang's chest, listening carefully. "It's hypothermic," she confirmed, her brow furrowed in concern. "Badly." James swallowed hard. He had seen a lot in his years, but the sight of such a strong, untamed creature, brought down to this, on the brink of death, made his heart ache. "Can we save it?" he asked, already bracing for the worst. Emily exhaled, glancing up at him. "If we can warm it up fast, maybe. But James..." She hesitated. "There's something else." James frowned. "What do you mean?" She shifted slightly, brushing some of the frost off the Mustang's coat. Then, gently, she lifted its head just enough to expose something neither of them had noticed before. A deep, jagged scar ran along the horse's neck. Old, but unmistakable. It wasn't from the cold. James's stomach dropped. That kind of scar. It meant one thing. This horse hadn't just wandered here. Someone had been after it. But why? And more importantly, who? James exhaled, his fists clenching at the thought. He had spent his life around horses, raising and training them with patience and care. He had no tolerance for those who used cruelty as a method. But if it escaped, he said slowly, then someone might be looking for it. Emily nodded. And not for the right reasons. James stood and paced the barn, his boots crunching against the dirt floor. His land was far from town, quiet and isolated. If someone had chased this Mustang all the way out here, they had to be desperate to get it back. And that meant whoever was watching him earlier wasn't just a curious passerby. He stopped near the stall, studying the horse. "There's something about this Mustang," he murmured. "It's not just any wild horse." Emily looked at him, waiting. James took a deep breath, the pieces starting to come together in his mind. There had been rumors, talk among ranchers and horse traders about a particular Mustang, one unlike any other, a horse that had survived things no other could, a horse with strength and endurance beyond normal. Some claimed it had been part of a controversial breeding program meant to create the strongest Mustang in existence. Others said it had once belonged to a powerful, dangerous man who never let anything of his go without a fight. If this was that horse, then James and Emily had just found themselves in the middle of something much bigger than they realized. A sudden sound outside made them both freeze. Footsteps, crunching in the snow. James exchanged a look with Emily, then moved to the barn door, opening it just enough to peer outside. His property stretched out into thick woods, the snowfall covering most tracks, but he knew what he had heard. Someone was close. Then, a voice, low, cautious. "James Carter." James stiffened. He didn't recognize the voice, but whoever it was knew his name. He stepped out fully, the cold biting against his skin. A man stood a few yards away, his hands visible, not holding a weapon, but his stance tense, ready. He was dressed in a heavy coat and boots, like someone who had been out in the wilderness for a long time. His face was partially covered by a scarf, but his eyes were sharp, scanning James carefully. James didn't speak, waiting. The man hesitated, then nodded toward the barn. You have something that belongs to me." James felt the weight of the situation settle fully on his shoulders. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This man had been looking for the Mustang, and he wasn't asking. James squared his stance, keeping his voice steady. "I don't know what you're talking about." The man let out a slow breath, his eyes darkening. "I think you do." A silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken tension. James could feel Emily just behind him, standing in the barn doorway, probably gripping something in case things went south. Then, the Mustang inside let out a low, weak whinny. The man's posture shifted, and for a split second, something flickered in his expression. Something almost like regret. James caught it. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just after the horse. There was something more. "What do you want with it?" James asked, watching closely. The man hesitated, then said, "To make sure it doesn't fall into the wrong hands." James studied him, trying to decide if he was lying. Then, from somewhere deeper in the woods, another sound. More movement, more people. James's stomach dropped. If this man wasn't alone, then there was more at play than he realized. And if others were coming, it meant time was running out for him, for Emily, and for the Mustang.